A cotton mill in Fayetteville, Tennessee. November 1910. A photographer walks in, looks at one boy, and writes a single line, a line that is still in the Library of Congress. Leo, 48 inches high, 8 years old, picks up bobbins at 15 cents a day. 15 cents a day. The photographer asked Leo what he did with the money. The boy's answer went into the caption too. "No, I don't help me sister or mother, just myself." Here is the part nobody tells you. What was happening to Leo was not a scandal. It was not a crime. It was a wage. And from the founding of the Republic until October 1938, 162 years, there was no lasting federal law that said any wage was too low. Not 15 cents a day for an 8-year-old. Not 5 cents an hour for a grown woman shelling pecans in Texas. And that one was still happening in 1938. Not the pay stub a Pullman worker took home in 1894, 2 weeks of labor, and after the company took back its rent, 2 cents. For all that time, American labor had one price, whatever you were desperate enough to take. This is the story of the judges who ruled for 30 years that no wage in America could be too low, and of the hotel maid from Wenatchee, Washington, who was owed $216, refused to settle for $17, and broke the entire system open. Follow the money. This is Greenback Files. Start with the biggest number first, because it isn't the wage, it's the hours. In 1907, the Bureau of Labor Statistics measured the working week of a laborer at a blast furnace. The average came out at 75.8 hours. That is not a typo. 12-hour shifts, 7 days a week, an 84-hour week was ordinary in steel. And that schedule did not end in some distant Victorian past. The 12-hour day survived in American steel mills until late 1923. So what did the hours buy? In 1901, the federal government ran one of the largest household surveys it had ever attempted. More than 25,000 working-class families. The average family earned $749.50 a year. It spent almost all of it, nearly half on food alone. Bread was 5 cents a loaf. There was nothing left over because there was nothing extra coming in. And that was a family, usually with several people working. Because here is the arithmetic that explains everything else in this story. One wage could not carry one household. In 1905, the census counted what factories paid. Men averaged $11.16 a week. Women, $6.17. A woman working full-time, year-round, earned roughly $320, less than half of what that 1901 family budget demanded. The gap had to be filled by someone. It was filled by children. Around 1900, of nearly 100,000 textile workers in the American South, about 25,000 were children under 16. In North Carolina's spinning rooms, 3/4 of the spinners were 14 or younger. A federal survey of Southern mills around 1908 found the children who doffed bobbins earning $2.52 a week for a 63-hour week. Run the division. 4 cents an hour. The photographer who found Leo was named Lewis Hine. He spent a decade sneaking into mills and mines and canneries for the National Child Labor Committee, and he wrote what he saw straight into his captions, like a man leaving evidence for a trial he knew was coming. In Lancaster, South Carolina, Sadie Pfeiffer, 48 inches high, has worked half a year. In the photograph, she is a small blur of a girl in front of a spinning frame that runs on behind her like a train. In North Pownell, Vermont, Addie Card, 12 years. Girls in mills say she is 10 years. Addie told Hine she'd started during school vacation. She never went back. In a West Virginia coal mine, Hine photographed a boy named Vance, a trapper boy, 15 years old. His entire job was to sit alone in the dark and open one wooden door for the coal cars. 10 hours a day, 75 cents. Hine's camera caught something he couldn't see with his own eyes. The boy had covered the door in drawings. It was so dark in the mine that they only became visible when the photographic plate was developed. And in Bessemer City, North Carolina, in 1912, Hine documented what happened when it went wrong. Giles Newsom, 11 years old, caught his hand in the unguarded gears of a spinning machine. It tore off 2 fingers. Then his parents tried to change his age on paper, to make him 13. Because at 13, the work would have been legal, and nobody would be in trouble. That is what no minimum actually meant. Not just low pay, a labor market where the only thing cheaper than a man was his wife, and the only thing cheaper than his wife was his child. In the summer of 1903, the labor organizer Mother Jones marched a column of children from the textile mills of Philadelphia toward President Theodore Roosevelt's summer home on Long Island. By her own account, children came to the strike headquarters with hands off, thumbs missing, fingers off at the knuckle. Philadelphia's mansions, she wrote, were built on the broken bones, the quivering hearts and drooping heads of these children. Roosevelt never met them. His secretary turned them away. Nothing changed. And when reformers finally tried to change it with law, they ran into a wall. Not a wall of factory owners, a wall of judges. In 1895, New York passed a simple law. No bakery could work its men more than 60 hours a week. A bakery owner in Utica named Joseph Lochner broke it, took the fine, and fought it all the way up. In 1905, the Supreme Court handed him the country. The right to make a contract about your own labor, the majority declared, is part of the liberty protected by the 14th Amendment. Laws like New York's were, their words, mere meddlesome interferences with the rights of the individual. 5 words would hang over American workers for the next 30 years. Liberty of contract. If a mill offered 4 cents an hour and a 12-year-old took it, the Constitution, as read by 5 justices, called that freedom. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote a dissent that became more famous than the decision, "A constitution is not intended to embody a particular economic theory." He was outvoted. Lochner became the name of an era. Reformers probed for cracks. In 1908, they found one. The court unanimously upheld an Oregon law limiting women's working hours, but on the theory that women's physical structure and the performance of maternal functions justified special protection. Hold on to that reasoning. 15 years later, it would be turned against the very women it protected. Meanwhile, the workers forced the question themselves. In November 1909, at a packed meeting at Cooper Union in New York, a 23-year-old garment worker pushed past 2 hours of cautious speeches and demanded the floor. Her name was Clara Lemlich. She had been arrested 17 times on picket lines, and hired thugs had broken 6 of her ribs. She spoke in Yiddish, and the contemporary press recorded her words. "I am a working girl, one of those who are on strike against intolerable conditions. I am tired of listening to speakers who talk in general terms. I offer a resolution that a general strike be declared. Now." 20,000 shirtwaist makers walked out. They won raises in most shops. But one of the biggest holdouts, a factory that refused to budge on unions and safety, was the Triangle Waist Company. 16 months later, on March 25, 1911, fire broke out on the Triangle factory's upper floors. The workers there, mostly young immigrant women, worked 52 hours a week for $7 to $12. When the fire spread, one stairway was choked with flame. The other door was locked. Not to trap anyone. It was locked as company policy, to prevent theft and unauthorized breaks. It amounted to the same thing. The fire escape collapsed. 146 people died in 18 minutes. The youngest, Kate Leone and Rosaria Maltese, were 14. Rosaria's mother and sister died with her. The owners were tried for manslaughter. The jury had to decide one narrow question. Did they know the door was locked at that moment? On December 27, 1911, they were acquitted. 3 years later, civil suits settled at $75 per life. The owner's insurance had already paid them roughly $400 per victim. Read that ledger again. A dead worker. $75 to her family. The same dead worker. $400 to the man who locked the door. Triangle did not create a minimum wage. Be careful with that myth. What it created was New York's factory safety revolution, and it seared itself into a young social worker named Frances Perkins, who stood on the sidewalk and watched. Remember her name. She'll be back. What Triangle did do was make sweated labor a national question. And states moved first, 26 years before Washington. Massachusetts, 1912. America's first minimum wage law, covering only women and children, setting no wage, a commission would recommend a minimum, and an employer who refused to pay it faced exactly one punishment. His name printed in the newspaper. No fine, no jail, shame. 8 states followed in 1913, some with real teeth, binding wage commissions in Oregon, Washington, California. In 1917, the Supreme Court split 4-4 on Oregon's law, a tie that settled nothing and left the whole question hanging on one vote for 6 more years. Then came Adkins. The District of Columbia had a minimum wage board for women. Congress itself had created it. And in 1923, the challenge that killed it came wrapped in the most disarming package imaginable. A 21-year-old elevator operator named Willie Lyons. She ran the elevator at the Congress Hall Hotel for $35 a month plus 2 meals a day. The legal minimum for her job was $71.50. The hotel said it couldn't pay that and let her go. Accounts of the case add a detail. It hired a man. Men weren't covered. So Willie Lyons sued, not for a higher wage, for the right to work below the minimum. Her work, the court record says, was light and healthful, the hours short, with surroundings clean and moral, and she was anxious to continue it for the compensation she was receiving. Historians have long noted the case had the fingerprints of an employer-side test suit all over it, but it worked. On April 9, 1923, the Supreme Court struck down the D.C. minimum wage, 5-3. Justice Sutherland's reasoning was a masterpiece of the era. Women had just won the vote, he wrote, so the old differences between men and women had shrunk almost, if not quite, to the vanishing point. The protection built on women being different was demolished because women were now equal. And the minimum wage itself? A compulsory exaction from the employer for the support of a partially indigent person. Chief Justice Taft dissented. You cannot logically allow hours laws and forbid wage laws. One is the multiplier and the other the multiplicand. It didn't matter. Adkins froze minimum wage law in America for 14 years. State laws were struck down or went dormant, unenforced, gathering dust. One of those dusty sleeping laws was in Washington state. Passed in 1913. Never repealed. $14.50 a week for chambermaids. Remember that one too. Then the economy itself collapsed, and the question stopped being theoretical. Between 1929 and 1934, the average factory work week fell from over 50 hours to barely 34. Not because anyone passed a law, but because there was no work. By the mid-30s, roughly 1 in 5 American workers was unemployed, and the ones still working discovered what a labor market with no floor does in a depression. it digs. The Bureau of Labor Statistics measured entry wages for unskilled men in 1936, 45 cents an hour, if you were white, 35 cents if you were black. Same job. 10-cent discount, printed right into the national statistics. And at the very bottom, something was happening that two black journalists, Ella Baker and Marvel Cook, went undercover to document in 1935. On street corners in the Bronx, black women stood and waited, while housewives walked the line and bid for a day of their labor. Before relief programs gave the women any fallback at all, the bids ran as low as 15 cents an hour. Baker and Cook's report ran in a national magazine under the title, The Bronx Slave Market. That was 1935, not 1835. Washington had, in fact, already tried something. In June 1933, the new Roosevelt administration launched the National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRA, and its agency, the NRA, with its blue eagle emblem in every shop window. We do our part. Industry by industry, codes of fair competition set minimum wages, generally $12 to $15 a week. Millions of employers signed. And at the signing, on June 16, 1933, Franklin Roosevelt said the sentence this whole story had been waiting for. No business which depends for existence on paying less than living wages to its workers has any right to continue in this country. By living wages, I mean more than a bare subsistence level. I mean the wages of decent living. Note the date, 1933, about the NIRA. You will see that quote pasted onto 1938. It belongs here, 5 years earlier, attached to a program that was about to die. Because, on May 27, 1935, Black Monday, the Supreme Court killed the NIRA. Unanimously. 9-0, even the court's liberals. Extraordinary conditions, wrote Chief Justice Hughes, do not create or enlarge constitutional power. Justice Cardozo, concurring, called the code system delegation running riot. 2 years of federal wage floors, gone in an afternoon. And 1 year later, the court went further. A Brooklyn laundry manager named Joseph Tipaldo had been paying 9 women $10 a week when New York State's minimum required 14,80 dirt. His solution was elegant. He raised their pay on the books, then forced the women to kick the difference back in cash, and falsified the records. He went to jail. His case went up. And on June 1, 1936, 5 justices set him free and struck down New York's minimum wage law. The state, they wrote, is without power by any form of legislation to prohibit, change, or nullify contracts between employers and adult women workers as to the amount of wages to be paid. Justice Stone, in dissent, could barely keep the contempt off the page. It is difficult, he wrote, to imagine any grounds other than our own personal economic predilections for the majority's position. The reaction was something new. It wasn't just labor that howled. Republicans denounced the decision. Herbert Hoover denounced it. Congressman Hamilton Fish, no radical, called it a new Dred Scott decision. Roosevelt, at his press conference the next day, said the court had created a no-man's land where no government, state or federal, can function. Think about where America stood in the summer of 1936, 5 months before a presidential election. The state laws struck down. The federal codes struck down. A women's minimum wage struck down. Again. Every road to a wage floor had now been closed by the same 9 men. Which brings us to a hotel in Wenatchee, Washington, and the chambermaid who had already, quietly, filed the case that would end the era. The Cascadian Hotel was the tallest building in Wenatchee, Apple Country, Central Washington. Starting in the late summer of 1933, a woman around 40 named Elsie Parrish cleaned its rooms. She scrubbed toilets, made beds, hauled the vacuum down the corridors. She was already a grandmother. The hotel paid her 22 cents an hour, later 25. Here's what the hotel apparently never checked. That sleeping Washington law from 1913, never repealed, never enforced, entitled a chambermaid to $14.50 a week. When the hotel let her go in May 1935, Elsie Parrish did something nobody was doing in 1935. She took the law at its word. She sat down and calculated everything she had been underpaid across a year and a half of shifts. It came to $216.19. The hotel offered $17 to make her go away. Full and final settlement. She said no. A local lawyer named C.B. Connor took her case knowing she couldn't pay him. On June 10, 1935, at the Chelan County Courthouse, he filed Ernest Parrish and Elsie Parrish, his wife, versus West Coast Hotel Company. The trial judge did exactly what every judge in America had done since 1923. He pointed at Adkins and ruled for the hotel. But in April 1936, the Washington Supreme Court did something strange. It refused to follow Adkins and upheld the 1913 law. The hotel appealed to the United States Supreme Court. So in December 1936, 6 months after Topaldo, with the court's prestige at its lowest point in memory, the 9 justices heard the case of a chambermaid's back pay. You may have heard what happened next, called the switch in time that saved 9. Roosevelt unveils his plan to pack the court in February 1937, and Justice Owen Roberts, terrified, switches sides to save the institution. Great story. The chronology kills it. The justices voted on Parrish in their private conference on December 19, 1936, 7 weeks before the court-packing plan existed, and Roberts, who had voted against New York's law in Topaldo, voted to uphold Washington's. The decision only came out later because a justice was ill. Roberts's own explanation was narrow and procedural. Historians still argue how much the political earthquake around the court weighed on him. What the record shows is simple. The switch came first. On March 29, 1937, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 for Elsie Parrish. Chief Justice Hughes, writing for the majority, finally said what reformers had waited 32 years to hear. The Constitution does not speak of freedom of contract. And then he flipped the entire moral frame of the era. Paying workers less than they can live on, he wrote, isn't freedom. It forces the public to carry the cost. The community is not bound to provide what is, in effect, a subsidy for unconscionable employers. Adkins was overruled. By name. Sutherland read his dissent. The meaning of the Constitution does not change with the ebb and flow of economic events. But the wall had fallen. A hotel maid's $216 had done what 3 decades of legislation could not. In the Labor Department, Frances Perkins, the woman who had stood on that sidewalk in 1911, now the first woman ever to sit in an American cabinet, had been keeping a draft wage and hour bill in her desk for exactly this moment. By her own account, Roosevelt grinned at her. What happened to that nice unconstitutional bill you had tucked away? The door was open. Now they had to get a bill through Congress. That fight would be uglier than the court. Roosevelt had been carrying this issue in his pocket for years, literally. During the 1936 campaign, in a Massachusetts mill town, a young woman tried to pass him a note. A policeman threw her back into the crowd. Roosevelt saw it. Get the note from the girl. It read, in effect, I work in a sewing factory. They used to pay us $11 a week. Now we get 4 to 6. On May 24, 1937, with the parish ruling 8 weeks old, Roosevelt sent Congress the bill, along with the message that gave the fight its language. A self-supporting and self-respecting democracy can plead no justification for the existence of child labor, no economic reason for chiseling workers' wages or stretching workers' hours. Goods made under substandard conditions, he said, should be treated as contraband. The bill was black connery, 40 cents an hour as the eventual floor, 40 hours as the week. Senator Hugo Black of Alabama, who 4 years earlier had pushed a 30-hour work week through the Senate, carried it. The Senate passed a weakened version that July, 56-28. Then it hit the House Rules Committee. And the real machine of resistance, the Southern Democrats. Understand the economics of their revolt. Wages in the South ran drastically below the North. During the debate, fewer than 3% of industrial workers outside the South earned under the proposed minimum. In the South, nearly 20%. A national floor was, from the Southern mill owner's chair, a weapon aimed at his one competitive advantage: cheap labor. Congressman John McClellan of Arkansas put it on the record, "What profiteth the laborer of the South if he gain the enactment of a wage and hour law, if he then lose the opportunity to work?" The garment union's answer became famous. Fine, then lower pay for Southern congressmen. The Rules Committee simply buried the bill. Roosevelt called Congress back into special session that November. In December 1937, the House voted to send the bill back to committee. Killed it by roughly 20 votes. Francis Perkins had never seen a major administration bill executed in public like that. What resurrected it wasn't argument. It was an election. On May 3, 1938, in Florida's Senate primary, Claude Pepper, campaigning flat out for the wage and hour bill, crushed his anti-New Deal opponent. Every congressman in Washington could read a return sheet. Minimum wage won votes in the South. 3 days later, supporters filed a discharge petition to blast the bill out of committee. It needed 218 signatures. Members stood in line down the center aisle of the House to sign it. It filled in 2 hours and 20 minutes. After that, it was an avalanche. The House passed it 314-97. The price of Southern acquiescence was carved into the final text. Not 40 cents to start, but 25. On June 25, 1938, Roosevelt signed the Fair Labor Standards Act, one of a stack of 121 bills he signed that day before Congress went home. The night before, in a fireside chat, he'd already delivered the eulogy for the era of no floor, and a warning about the propaganda to come. Do not let any calamity-howling executive with an income of $1,000 a day tell you that a wage of $11 a week is going to have a disastrous effect on all American industry. $11 a week, the exact wage the girl in the mill town had lost. 25 cents an hour, 44 hours. That was the number. On October 24, 1938, a federal wage floor arrived in America, and this time it never left. So, did it work? Here the story stops being a courtroom drama and becomes a ledger. And an honest ledger has entries on both sides. Start with who got a raise. When the law took effect, it covered just under 11 million workers, the Labor Department's own count, and about 300,000 of them were earning under 25 cents. They got an immediate raise. Nearly 1.4 million more were working longer than the new 44-hour week. The next October, the floor rose to 30 cents. In 1945, 40. Now the other side of the ledger. 11 million covered, out of a workforce several times that size. The law only reached workers in commerce, or in the production of goods for commerce. And on top of that, it explicitly exempted farm laborers, along with retail, fishing, and more. Domestic workers, the maids and cooks, fell outside it too, which meant the exclusions traced a very particular map. Agriculture and domestic service were where roughly 65% of Black American workers earned their living. The people at the very bottom of the wage scale, The Bronx street corner women, the sharecroppers, were precisely the people the first minimum wage never touched. Was that the deliberate price of Southern votes, or the limit of what 1938 could administer? Historians still argue both sides. There's real evidence for each. What nobody disputes is the effect. The majority of black workers stood outside the law. Farm workers wouldn't be covered until 1966. Domestic workers, 1974. And where the law did bite hardest, it cut. Remember the San Antonio pecan shellers, 12,000 workers, mostly Mexican-American women, shelling nuts for around 5 or 6 cents an hour. In January 1938, they struck, led by 21-year-old Emma Tenayuka, through tear gas and 700 arrests, and won a raise of about a penny a pound. That October, the new federal law quintupled their legal wage overnight. The operators looked at 25 cents an hour, looked at the price of cracking machines, and chose the machines. Within about 3 years, more than 10,000 shelling jobs were gone. It's the detail that breaks every simple version of this story. Even the shellers' own union asked Washington for an exemption from the minimum wage. They were refused. Offshore, it was starker still. In Puerto Rico, where the island's huge home needlework industry paid wages measured in pennies an hour, the mainland's 25 cents landed like an embargo. Contemporary accounts describe the industry collapsing, and within 2 years Congress retreated, carving out special lower wage boards for the island in 1940. Even on the mainland, the floor and the paycheck took years to converge. By the following spring, 600,000 to 700,000 covered workers were still earning below 30 cents. The next rung of the ladder, due that October. And the agency, policing all of it, the new wage and hour division, was tiny. Congress was already raging at its snooping inspectors. Economists have fought over this ledger for 87 years. One camp warning that wage floors destroy the very jobs they protect, the other pointing to studies finding no job losses at all. The honest summary is this: modest floors, modestly set, did roughly what mainland America experienced in 1938. Floors set far above a local market did what San Antonio and Puerto Rico experienced. History armed both sides and settled the argument for neither. One last calculation, because this channel always runs the numbers. 25 cents in October 1938 works out, in today's money, to roughly $5.50 an hour. The current federal minimum wage is $7.25, which means the most famous wage floor in world history began lower, in real purchasing power, than the number Americans argue about today. Its real value peaked back in 1968, and $7.25 has now stood untouched since 2009, the longest freeze since Leo picked up bobbins. Today, about 1% of American hourly workers earn the federal floor or less. 30 states have set their own higher lines. The federal minimum is now mostly binding in one region. Look at the map. It's the same map as 1938. And the tipped minimum? The cash wage for the waitress? $2.13 an hour. Frozen since 1991. As for the law itself, Roosevelt called it, except perhaps for the Social Security Act, the most far-reaching, far-sighted program for the benefit of workers ever adopted here or in any other country. The woman who had carried it in her desk drawer, Frances Perkins, watched it become real. 27 years after she stood on a sidewalk in New York and watched the Triangle workers fall. Elsie Parrish got her money, all $216.19, about 2 years after she last cleaned a room at the Cascadian. By then she was already working at a laundry in the next town. No committee ever asked her to speak. No school put her in a textbook while she lived. She moved to California, And when a journalist finally tracked her down almost 40 years later, she was mostly surprised anyone remembered. She said she was proud of what she'd done. For all the women scrubbing floors in hotels. According to her family, one afternoon in April 1980, after visiting her newborn great-great-grandson, she lay down for a nap and died in her sleep. The woman who ended the Lochner era got $17 offered, held out for $216, and changed the price of an hour of American work. Leo would have turned 36 the year the law passed. We don't know if he lived to see it. We know what he'd have made under it. 25 cents an hour? $2 a day? 13 times his wage. A floor is just a number until you stand on it. This has been Greenback Files. Follow the money.